pleasant to T-Lane, no matter where she was, whistling through her wavy amber hair or swirling through the trees near her home. It all sounded harsh and haunting to her. The white of the moon emphasized her loneliness under its glow in the dark of the night. One woman, one lonely fragile soul displaced in a void. The black shapes of the trees and grass rustled around her, bragging about their freedom while she watched from her mental cell. She leaned herself against the rustic iron door frame of Hawk's ancestral cabin house as she had every night for the last 5 years. An entire field spanned before her. The sleepless city of Bean rested only a few miles beyond the winding hills across from her ranch, but she couldn't move under the weight of her sadness. She hated the shape of everything she saw, the tin roof of the garage, the 3 hillsides weaving themselves together before her view met the dancing lights of Bean, and the mob of trees bending over her acre of land like hands ready to claw down and pin her to the ground. She stared up at the trees, trying to lose herself in the vast night sky beyond their reach. The branches were shadows shaking in the wind, keeping the full beauty of space away from her yearning stare. The thick mountain winds and rattling twigs made T-Lane curl her tiny ivory toes on the dense wood floor like the forest mocking her, waving and whistling at her as she nestled in solidarity. Hawk had worked his entire life to make her satisfied, but T-Lane never would have imagined she'd live on a ranch away from everything that made her happy. The beguiling lights of Bean continued to blink in her blurring sight, beckoning her to fade into them and away from the lonely hill, begging her to let them carry her into their familiar embrace, back to her comfort. She sighed. Her neck had finally given the last of its strength, and her head met the cold iron door frame. Her jaw quivered under the weight of her dreams about the parties happening in the city she would never see again. Her flimsy, boring nightgown flicked and billowed over the folds of her body, making her face slowly clench, holding her tears back in her head. She missed her slender, smooth youth from only 5 years ago. The 4 red-haired munchkins sleeping upstairs ensured she would never feel like dancing ever again. In a month, she would be 20. If she were lucky, she would have another 20 years. 30 full years would be a miracle, but the cold thought of 10 years lay heavy in her head, weighing her distant stare and the corners of her mouth down to the ground. She had heard people tell her how short life on Centaurus was her entire life, always taunting her to live to the fullest before inevitably turning into dust, their crushed aspirations pressing down on her own, the promise of death always nesting in her ears to bite at her mind. T-Lane's face squirmed. She shook her head, silently cursing herself. She had to remind herself that she wasn't stupid, that she was a responsible adult. She chose to have her children. She could never blame them for her own mistakes. She should never blame them for her own mistakes. Her children. Her eyes rested in her head while she lost herself to her thoughts. The wind blew against her, inviting itself into the house. The world continued taunting her. She thought the trees would laugh if they could, mocking her foolishness. Thankfully, their constant shaking would suffice for proper torment. She looked down at her toes. If her aging belly hung any farther out, she would have thrown herself off the nearest cliff. Her eyes had managed to stay dry, suffering the indifference blossoming from her endless depression, but the sides of her head pulsed from her clenched teeth. T-Lane turned her head back to the sky, sending her breath up into the night. Her lips pressed together, her quivering intensified from the strain she had built. There is no reason not to love Hawk, she thought to herself. Would a man who let her live under the roof that housed his generations be any less deserving of love? It was nothing short of a blessing that he had given her a place to live, children to raise, and a peaceful life away from the shallow-minded people of the city below, away from their laughter and their lights and their music and their fun. As her mind continued to spin further down the spiral of her despair, the world stood still. The unsettling sudden silence of the world around her woke her from her trance. Her gaze darted around the ranch, waiting for something to happen, expecting the world to explode after it caught up with her thoughts. A crash echoed from the other side of the property. T-Lane clutched her chest with her other grip holding the door frame, catching herself before she could fall. The irons of her Centaurus and biology glowed out of her collarbones, gleaming through her slender delicate fingers in the pink light she had glowed since her birth. She rose back to standing and peered in the direction of the crash, squinting to focus on what looked like a large shadow crawling around the garage. She waited to hear her children cry from the noise. Hawk's fat steps on the wooden floor were absent. The whole world had hushed so she could bear the disturbance occurring on her ranch. Maybe it was the emptiness within her that kept her still, unable to dash up the wooden steps to wake her husband to investigate the noise. Whatever the sensation was, it was urging her to head towards the noise on her own. T-Lane left the doorway into the soft, cool grass. Her plain white nightgown flicked behind her motion in the darkness, like the wisps of a ghost. She carefully glided her steps across the soft dirt driveway, cautiously trying not to attract the invading shadow's attention. She was a step away from the garage when she heard grunting coming from the ground. She turned a corner and a gasp escaped her throat. A tall man clad in black Duke's armor lay on the ground, a shining red saber adorned with ancient Gothic ornaments and talismans firmly in his grip. The royal engravings of his steel alloy armor shone under the garage wall light, brandishing pictures of monsters and battles, no doubt significant to a royal lineage. His pitch-black hair, wet with sweat and rain, strung over his face and dripped onto his battle-torn cloak, flowing into the blood dripping off his blade. The thick calcium strands of a royal dimmed and glowed in his black mop of hair, pacing with his wounded breathing, the biological white glow of his birth fading farther with every breath. The armored man looked up at T-Lane as she inched closer to him, revealing his dark sunken green eyes to her. His intense gaze softened, finding familiarity with her.